Welcome to the Embodiment podcast. This show is for you if you see the body as more than a brain taxi. It's for people interested in coming home to the body as a holistic aspect of who we are and how we live. Episodes contain practical tips, exercises you can take away, and interviews with specialists from around the world. I'm your host for today, Mark Walsh. On the show today, joining us from New York, Scott Lyons. So Scott has got a ridiculously good CV. So he is the co-creator of Embodied Flow, which I know from Tara Judelle, clinical psychologist, BMC practitioner, craniosacral, various other things. He's also came up with this Embodied Consciousness training, which has got some of the best people in the world on, and who can tell us all about that. That's happening in California. We'll talk about that later. But I'm actually just looking forward to getting to know you a bit, Scott, as potentially a kindred spirit. So, Scott, welcome.
Thank you so much, Mark. Nice to be here, and thanks for having me.
And what was the beginning of your journey with the body?
I would say part of the beginning of the journey with the body was not feeling my body, which is, I think, often many people's journey is having a little bit of less familiarity, less tangible sensation, less embodiment, we could say. And then coming across these moments or these opportunities to really kind of re-inhabit myself, and which just sort of slingshot me into this very exciting journey of really learning what is the body, and on many different levels, from an anatomical level, from a psychological level, from a spiritual level. And it's been a really beautiful process. And you mentioned in my CV, body mind centering, and that was one of my first introductions to somatic practices or embodiment practices that really has shaped so much of my life as it is now. Which I'm super grateful.
You told me you were 16 when you met Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen. That's an incredibly young age to meet the sort of greats of this work.
Yeah, I was in school in college at the time, and I dropped out of a class. And the only class that hadn't started in the university was a class called Body Mind Centering. And because of my age, I had to be enrolled in a certain amount of credits. And so I just took that class. I had no idea what it was. And it was the first time I remember these moments of actually feeling like I arrived home in myself. And I had a string of learning disabilities, and I could actually experience like a veil being lifted off of my challenges with attention and focus and language skills issues through this process of body mind centering, it's very close and near and dear to me for so many reasons, including that. Yeah, and I got to meet Bonnie and spend a lot of time with her from a very early period of my life.
So, I mean, you're relatively young, and I might call this like the Renaissance Man podcast or something, just because the amount of stuff you've done, from sort of yoga to therapy. I mean, did you sort of come straight out of like high school and start training in this stuff?
Yeah, I did a lot of overlapping training. So I was in maybe undergrad when I started body mind centering, and then was on the weekends started training in craniosacral therapy, then osteopathy, and then just started doing every training I possibly could. I was just hungry for information and for more of this inhabitance and experience, and then how to then apply it in working with others. And I think what's exciting to me is that it's a continual process of learning, that I don't think anyone arrives and they're just boom, embodied, and boom, can just work with people, every single person, because of the unique process of each human being. I think it's just so exciting to have so many different maps and tools as a way to support other people and the continual journey that we each have.
And I think you're someone that brings practitioners together, that's brought different approaches together in yourself. this obviously this is what the podcast's all about. It's what the conference is all about that I run. It's what my life's work's all about. So I feel like we might be kindred spirits here. And
most likely.
can you say something about how they fit together? Because it used to be that people sort of picked a team and they did one thing, and then they got fundamentalist about it, and maybe they did two things and brought them together in a new practice. And now there's just so much stuff available in Brighton, New York, San Francisco, Berlin, all the hubs. There's so much good stuff available. Can you say something a little bit about the integration and the challenges of that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I have to say, I was in the process of doing all of these healing modalities. I was also an artist, and I had no idea how all of this was going to integrate. And it didn't. For many years, it was awkward. It was kind of stuttering around all of these different modalities and practices. And it was only until I met Tara Judelle and we co-created Embodied Flow did I have a sort of a container to start to see where is the meeting ground of all of these modalities. What is the intentionality? What is the goals? What is the practices? And where do they interface? And thankfully, Embodied Flow became that meeting ground for me and Tara of both of our lives, of having so many different practices finally sort of synergistically folding in on itself. And what I find really interesting is, Tara Judelle comes from more the non-dual tantric lineage, and where we created Embodied Flow, there's so many overlaps with where all of these modalities interface with this thousands-year-old practice. In some ways, I would say the non-dual tantra really, to me, is the birth of somatic psychology, of holistic integrative therapies, which, I fall more in love with it every day, of just appreciation for, oh my gosh, all of these modalities that are so available, as you're talking about now, like, 30 years ago, we didn't have somatic experiencing so readily available. And, Thomas Hanna's work and Bonnie Bainbridge-Cohen's work, it wasn't in the realm of so accessible. Mm-hmm. And now we have so many amazing modalities, and and I'm so blessed to have the opportunity to study so many of them and to feel the interface. And that interface, that sort of integration point happened first in me as the process, and in addition to the process of building Embodied Flow. And the interface is, like most of the embodiment practices, language could never truly articulate the experience of that integration. But it is, going back to, you named the conference that I'm having, which is Embodied Consciousness, to me, that is the interface, that place of integration.
Okay, let's talk about Embodied Flow. This is on my list of things to train in. I always find by the time the dates come out, I never make them because it's quite big chunks and I'm busy. So by the time it's released, you need to
send us your dates, Mark.
Date and I'll be there. Okay, anywhere in the world, 2021. Tell me the dates. I'll be there. So,
I might know someone who might know the dates. So
okay, send them to me afterwards. So I met Tara in London. She was teaching at Tri. I got a very good impression of her personally and professionally, and just found her very amenable, and it was very interesting because she was putting quite sophisticated somatic practice into like a postural yoga framework. And I think the day I was at particularly was a fairly beginner's day, and there was all these sort of young yoga girls there who were used to doing kind of crap gymnastics, and and then sort of Tara was trying to open them up, and at one point she gets them, we were dancing, we're moving around the room, essentially dancing, and I'm like a pig in shit, just jumping around, having a good time, and I could feel like 3/4 of the room are like uncomfortable, and so I was very skillfully and gently kind of leading them towards a more felt body rather than a more gymnastic body. And it was very interesting to watch. And then she took one look at me and was like, "Who are you? Let's talk. Let's have lunch." And it was very interesting to see someone doing fairly serious somatic work, but in the context of modern postural yoga. I mean, is that essentially what you're doing with Embodied Flow? From my very limited experience, I don't want to misrepresent it in any way?
It's a great question. I think that's one of the avenues we use towards this process of coming into our full inhabitance of ourself, and then feeling as we inhabit more of ourself, there's an opportunity to then experience ourself as connected to something beyond or bigger or transpersonally beyond just the self. And
does have this non-dual aspect to it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like, again, it's another way of saying, how do we come home? Whether it's, we could say, to our true nature or to our essential nature, but how are we coming home, and not, and more specifically, into the experience itself of that? Because it's not just the concept. There's certainly beautiful teachers of philosophy, and it can live in the conceptual realm, which is different, as you know, and I assume most of your listeners know because they're tuning into a podcast called Embodiment, which is different than the felt sense or the embodied experience of the philosophy. And the philosophy itself is a map, and Tara is a beautiful facilitator of taking people through a map and recognizing that's not the end point. It's just the map to support people in their own realization of a territory of themselves, and the territory of themselves in relation to or as nature. And
let's get clear on this distinction. You sent me a question from like dualistic versus non-dualistic somatics.
Yeah.
What would that distinction be?
Yeah, so in mind-body medicine or somatics, that what's emerged is both a dualistic approach and a non-dualistic approach. And just in simplification, dualism would say there's mind and there's body, and that they're separate, and there's spirit. And maybe we want to work towards just having them all in relation to each other. And non-dualistic somatics is essentially saying, actually, those are different names for the same thing. And dualistic somatics, you'll see in various practices, and I actually am very open to this because I still think there's value in it. But dualism will more be like you intensify the witness to identify what's happening in the body. And so there's still a separation of going, enhance your witness, register what's happening. And there is a certain amount of space or distance in that's being created. And that would be more the dualistic somatics. It's often what I see, it is more prevalent or present in, I would say, trauma therapies, where there's more about autonomic regulation and trying to balance out activation states. And so there's a lot more bringing on the witness to do that. You might see that more in mindfulness practices, where in non-dual somatics, it is the direct experience of something. So it's the difference between saying, let's say something from body mind centering. It would be the difference between saying, oh, I know my cells are breathing because I can sort of witness it from sort of sitting on a pedestal and watching my breath, versus what is the actual tangible experience of the cells moving in relationship to the inpouring of fluids and all the contents the fluids are carrying in, and then the metabolic waste moving out. There's an actual tangible experience of it. It's like watching a sponge be squeezed and then feeling the sponge and water being squeezed and reopening. There's a fundamental difference between being the observer and being the entity or the agent of experience.
Yeah. I've talked about this when I talk about meditation with my students. Is often the mindfulness perspective is like, I'm aware of my body. And I say embodied practice is I'm aware as a body.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's really hard to explain to students what I mean, because it just sort of happened in my own practice one day. And now I'm trying to find a really nice link. I know you're interested in linguistics too, and I'm trying to find sort of clear instructions for leading that.
Yeah, I mean, it would be, to me, it's a little bit the difference of saying, oh, your body is not just, and in dualistic, I would say your body is something where something is happening to it. And in non-dualistic, you're part of the emergent process in which that is unfolding as part of being alive. And I mean, the trouble with linguistics and language is that it's symbolic. It's not meant to be the actual thing. Like when you look at a tree and you say tree, you might have a response from the symbol of the word, but the word isn't actually the experience of what a tree is in its essence.
Yeah, nice.
Like you might know dirt, but then when you go to actually feel the dirt and you feel the temperature and you feel the texture and you feel the qualities and characteristics, it goes beyond the symbolization of the language and into the direct experience of it. And that's what we're getting at too when we talk about the body, is that we're moving past sort of the self-concept of the body and into the felt sense of the body.
Very nice, very nice. I often find myself using the metaphor of taste. There's something about that sense which feels very close and in. We have to bring in our mouth to taste it. So,
we are kindred souls, because I also love to use the word taste, and often people are like, "How would I taste this?" But it is. It's almost like tasting life, or it's tasting what this is, as opposed to just sort of being, again, an observer or perspective with space around what that is, whether it's an emotion or a tree or a relationship.
So let's return to this topic of integration then. And I think maybe talking about the consciousness immersion is a good way in. I mean, A, because it's very live for you, and B, I want to give you a plug, but also it's a pretty unique event. And I feel like you were someone I wanted to speak to, and I felt like this is a great way into, like, you've got all these different teachers. So there's Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen from Body Mind Centering. There's, various teachers of meditation, of yoga. There's Judith Blackstone there, who you kind of introduced me to. Sally Kempton, there's various people who are kind of well known but have quite different approaches. So this is a few day intensive, right?
Yeah, it's 6-day intensive with the faculty.
And this is in Berkeley, which, obviously I actually set on fire if I go anywhere near Berkeley personally. So I can't come, unfortunately. But no, I couldn't do the date, or else I'd be there in a flash. But and how are you? How you integrate these different teachers? This is because it's one thing me having a podcast or a conference where I'm just throwing random stuff at people, but as I understand it, you're going for a really sort of integrated approach here.
Yeah. So I these faculty are the people I look up to in the world. They're my mentors, my teachers, my friends, and the generosity they have is incredible, in the sense that one of the things I said is, look, there are a lot of conferences out there where people essentially, they get a taste of this and a taste of that, and they get one subject matter and then they run to the next subject matter, which might be entirely different. And conferences are kind of like, it's like a popcorn situation where it's fun, where you're jumping from one thing to the next. And so you get a real diversity, and oftentimes you have to even choose whom you're going to. And I had said to them up front, I want to do something really different, which is all the students stay in one room. They don't have to choose who they're going to. And I want to co-create the curriculum with all of the faculty. So I'm well aware that each of us have a very different lens and map towards this process of embodying consciousness. And we have a place where we all overlap. And it's been such a generous, beautiful process of all of us coming together and actually co-creating this journey for the students of how you introduce multiple maps in an integrative way. And we have Tara Judelle in the mornings teaching a practice that is intended to integrate all the maps from the previous day. And then we have a section at the end of the day as well, in which all the faculty are together helping support the integration of what's come up that day. And in the process of that is, because we know where the journey is, because we've basically created the curriculum together, we can see what was needed to sort of support the next facilitator. And the next facilitator knows how to come after the previous one to create more of that seamless journey, which is incredibly, I mean, I've gone to many conferences and it's incredibly rare. And in fact, I've never actually experienced that before in this type of setting with this type of diversity of faculty who are, in my opinion, absolute legends of the practice, self-practice and practice of teaching others in terms of exploring this inquiry of what is consciousness and inhabiting it beyond the idea of a concept.
And you certainly lent here towards kind of some of the deeper people out there. You know, like Judith Blackstone, some serious depth there. I hear good things about this Michael Beckwith guy. I mean, like this is not Sally Kempton. This is not a sort of somatics light approach to this, is it?
No, these are heavy hitters. These are the people who have at least 30 years of self-practice or teaching other. Bonnie has been teaching for 50 years now. Mm-hmm. And, there's something to say that being in the room with someone, let alone a whole faculty of people, that when you walk in, the transmission is so palpable that in itself is a transformative experience.
I was just before I spoke to you, I was on the phone to Martin Elwood, who we had on the show actually as a senior British meditation teacher as a place in France. And afterwards, I spoke to him about an hour for something nothing to do with my own mind state, or we were talking about diversity conference and various other things. And after an hour, I just noticed I was feeling really good and sort of expanded. Now, maybe I was sitting under a tree, maybe it's an old friend that I was just reconnected with, but I'm pretty sure there was a little bit of that sort of just transfer of being around someone who sits a lot, even though it's on the phone in this case. And it's way more, we did find at the Embodiment conference last year, it's possible to get that online. Surprisingly possible, but it's still nothing quite like being in a room full of people who are some serious teachers. And then I imagine any practitioner that's coming, you're not going to be getting newbies, are you? It's not outrageously expensive, but it's a relatively big commitment financially, and it's I mean, for what it is, I think it's very reasonable actually, but most people are going to be coming from afar, and that kind of intention, that kind of group of people, even if all you did for the week was I don't know, play Monopoly or something. I think you still walk away from it with a fairly different state of body mind.
Yeah, I mean, every time I've left a faculty meeting, I feel, I feel changed. I feel transformed, and I've known all of these people for some time and hung out with them, and each have their own resonance, but the sort of the choir of vibration or resonance of all of them together is like nothing I've ever experienced before. And I've had some pretty wild experiences. And Tara and I hang up, with the rest of the faculty, and we just spend an hour unpacking and processing. Oh my God, Tara and I both, Tara's been in practice for 25, 30 years. I've been in practice for 20 years. And we're like, I don't even know how to process all of this. It's so exciting. And, that being said, I don't want anyone to be scared because it's so much, because the faculty is really incredible at pacing. And really titrating the process so that it's not overwhelming. And in that, it's why we co-created in the curriculum, why we co-created specific sections twice a day for integration. So that it's not just like, here's a bunch of stuff, go and be a puddle on the floor, because that's not so helpful all the time. It's like, here's a bit of information, here's another bit, and here's another bit, and here's how we actualize it in your own life and actualize it in working as a practitioner or a therapist or a yoga teacher or a parent. So it's tangible too. It's practical.
And what do you want people to sort of walk away from this? I mean, it's obviously going to be a feast of some kind, but I mean, is there like a set, I want people to get this? I mean, obviously, there's room for people's, emergent stuff to come out, but is there a kind of clear intention of how you want people to be at the end of this?
Yeah, I have my own intention. I know each faculty member has their own intention, which is really potent. It's the fuel to their process. And for me, one of my biggest inquiries and processes in life is looking at what happens in isolation and separateness. I happen to, that was my doctoral work too. Or we could say my obsession is, and what happens when we become desensitized to ourself, or desensitized in relationship, or desensitized in relation to the environment or community or another. And we see the symptoms of that. We see that as, well, in the body, we see it as symptoms like fibromyalgia, autoimmune disorders, any type of suppressive response. In relationships, we see it as, a certain surface level connection, or troublesome relationships. In communities or in cultures, we might see it as racism. In the environment, we see it as destruction. And I don't mean to be dramatic, but these are the symptomology of separation and isolation. I mean, in fact, the research does show that separation and isolation are the fundamental root causes of things like anxiety and depression, but also lead to antisocial behavior, or which is the number one cause for violence. Yep. So we can draw that linkage that, as we're talking about embodiment, which is a deep coming home back into the fundamental relationships. And whether we want to go there with consciousness, I would just say, simply said, consciousness is the primordial fundamental relationship. So, and the practice for me is coming back into deep relationship and recognizing where that relationship has been ruptured. And each of the faculty members has their own lens for viewing where ruptures occur. Reverend Angel and Ray Johnson are looking at it in relation to power dynamics. How do certain power dynamics and oppression and microaggressions create ruptures in relationship between ourselves and cultures, or ourselves and community? Teresa Silo is looking at it more from a developmental perspective of in the relationship or the growth process of how we experience our own identity and self, where that might have been sort of blocked or obstructed. And, Sally's looking at it from more the spiritual lens. Michael's looking at it from more the self-actualization lens. So we each have our own lens that, and in doing so, it really expands our concept of going, oh, this is where I already feel connection. And these are the places where connection is not as enlivened or strong or ruptured. And then the maps in which we all have to mend or heal those ruptures and come back to our fundamental state of interconnectivity.
Yeah, it makes sense for me as a sort of why of somatics, this reconnection to self, each other and the planet, and the violence that comes as a result of violence to self, violence to others. And that could be kind of politically in kind of groups, or personally. And then, the environmental aspect. So that kind of big why makes a lot of sense to me. And do you think there'll be disagreement here? Because they're probably coming from pretty different perspectives. Like, for someone from a kind of another generation, maybe the kind of some of the sort of more woke politics of California may seem foreign, or, from someone coming from a more meditative point of view, they might not see things politically, and vice versa, perhaps. I mean, is there room for kind of disagreement within it?
For sure. I mean, look, healing and transformation should be as unique as the individual whose process that is, which is why, to me, a multiplicity of maps or many maps in the same room is really important. Is because I don't wish to be everyone's facilitator or map. I couldn't even, to put that pressure on oneself to think that we could reach everyone, I think it's really false. And I am so grateful for the many disciplines of healing and transformation. And so that's why it's really important to say, okay, so I might not resonate with one of the facilitators, but to the other ones, I feel connected to that map. And where there's another opportunity here is to say, well, why don't I feel connected to so-and-so's map? What does that inform me about my own process? Where does that sort of come up against or create some friction towards my process, which is also a learning and an unveiling process? There are certain modalities of somatics where it doesn't resonate with me, or it didn't resonate with me, which is then I went and did the whole certification process to see what doesn't resonate with me, why doesn't? And at the end, it's like, well, what is the value that this has to offer? And in many cases, it was a disruption of, it was sort of scratching at certain identities, formations that I had and interrupting them. And in letting them really interrupt them, and building more tolerance for that, it expanded my own felt sense of who I was, as opposed to the concept of who I was.
Mm. Mm. And it's nice to see one person on there who's from a European background, even if she lives in California. Still, I find these American events are pretty American. Yeah. Usually different genders, different skin colors, but everyone American. So it's nice to see one German in there. I know our audience is pretty European on this podcast, so 50 states, 50% European. But, and
it helps. Many of the faculty have lived in Europe.
Lived there. Well, some of my favorite people are Americans who have lived in Europe, or Europeans who have lived in America. There's something about that cultural learning I find very attractive.
Yeah, I got to live in Germany, and it was a real expansive experience. And
expensive.
I know, yeah, I mean, it was a real
Oh, expansive. I thought you said expensive. Like it was a lot of money to live in Germany.
No, I lived in Berlin.
Berlin is cheap.
No, expansive in the sense that I have a family relative who's never left the US. And I see the ways in which there's just a limitation of certain perspectives because of that, where when you're immersed in a variety of perspectives, I also live in Indonesia for a couple months a year, and having to be and getting to be immersed in perspective in various perspectives can be expansive. It can really open an interpretation or view of the world, and hopefully in doing so even start to kind of to clear some of the dust of the mirror or the lens in which we're seeing the world. I mean, our perception of the world is our reality, but what we don't always get a chance to unpack or break down, because it can be difficult, is all the ways and things that created that lens of perception. And so rubbing up against, and having friction with things that really challenge the construction of that lens of perception eventually does expand our way of seeing and experiencing the world. And oftentimes that happens in somatic practices. I mean, I know you are also steeped in teaching somatics. It is intended when we are interfacing with more of ourselves, it will rub against and create friction from the self we knew.
Interesting. There's this. I feel like coming out of the 60s and 70s, the view was on universal. The body connects us to the shared body, and we all have a body, and there's something very beautiful in that. This idea of we're all one, and bodies are all the same, and it's very universal. And then now there's this understanding of but you might want to, if you spend time in Europe, you might see things differently. Or, a black friend of mine said to me, you don't talk about racism because you don't get any racism. It's not entirely true in some ways, actually. But that's, I got their point, and their point was fair. And it was or there's also within practices, this silos of people from a BMC point of view, maybe used to sort of rolling around on the floor. Yeah. And yogis sort of standing up and jumping around on their mat, and they're just going to have a different culture that may be invisible until you bump up into other cultures, other perspectives.
Yeah. And, I think that's one of the benefits of having a diversity of modalities to draw from, is to see where can we, Tara and I both feel this way, where can we support and enhance and enliven someone's experience of themselves, and possibly just create a little bit of friction of the status quo to potentially expand one's sense of self, or one sense of self in relation to the environment and all of these things, because all of these, on the lens of perception, there's going to be dust. There's going to be things that are creating that separateness. Those particles of dust or sand can get in the way of feeling our more fundamental relationships to ourselves, to other people, again, to the environment. And part of the challenging and delightful task of a facilitator will be to say, hey, there's some sand here, or create practices that create a mirror, essentially, towards those sand, towards those obstructions, or sort of delusion of separateness.
Do you think there's a risk of being spoiled with the teachers you have and I have, and the people we get to speak to on a daily basis? Phoning Martin in the park and then talking to you, and I'll be dancing fire rhythms with a world-class teacher this evening. That's just a sort of average day for me. Not for the whole world. I've lived in Ethiopia. I'm quite aware there are parts of the world that don't have basic things, let alone high-quality somatics. I was the only Aikido teacher in East Africa for a while.
Yeah.
And
wow.
And some of my students would, didn't have soap in their houses, for example. They were pretty poor. So it's pretty serious stuff. So I'm aware that we're living in these kind of fairly rarefied environments, both in terms of the physical needs that we don't have to worry about, but also in terms of what teaching we have available to us. And the internet, not everyone can make this event, obviously. There's a certain privilege to being able to be in California and afford it and go to the event. But then, people still have a lot available online. Like I was looking at Tammy Simon's brilliant Sounds True the other night, just going, there's so many great courses. How do I possibly have time to look at all these? Is there a risk of somehow being spoiled, or what do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly, it's a great question and not an easy one. And it does highlight a certain privilege perspective, which is important to recognize, and not always easy to sort of sit with. And it is the reason we created also for this event a scholarship program specifically for people who are wanting to engage in social activism through the lens of somatics. And we're just about to announce that. So, and I agree. I mean, accessibility, on one level, just getting people food and water is, when we look at like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where does somatics fit in to that process? And on some level, I would like to argue, but I don't actually, I don't have any scientific data to say I think it fits low on the sort of lower end of it, of certainly after food and water and fundamental relationship, or a sense of security and relationship. I think somatics is around there, of what allows individuals to feel safe or at home or connected to themselves or connected to their community, even if it's not, what we might say as ideal circumstances or conditions. Where is there an opportunity to connect? And I have worked with many individuals to support a program in the UN, in working with NGOs about how do we sit with someone in the unbearableness of seeing the absolute destitute of being human. And it's not. And one of the things that I learned as a practice, because I work as a trauma therapist, and have sat for hours in rooms with people who have had these deep, painful, deteriorating experiences, and how do you sit with them? And in addition to fundamental resources like food and water, and this might sound sort of strange, but sitting with someone in presence and recognizing and there's where are there still their strengths, where are still their capacities, sitting with another human being and meeting them in that, even if it's meeting them in that and the just horrific experiences they've had can be so fundamentally healing. And I don't mean that will take away their destitute, that won't take away the challenges of their daily life, but to know that there's another human being that can be there and to show up with them is absolutely significant. And I don't want to undermine that process of learning and growing for oneself in practice, to be able to do that with other people. I have some clients, or I had some clients who, when I worked in clinics, whom were homeless. And I remember one woman who said to me, we didn't do so much emotional processing in the way of going back in history. It didn't feel right for either of us to be there. And she just said, thank you so much. People pass me on the street. I spend most of my day feeling like I'm not deserving of human connection. And just the fact that you're willing to sit with me and be in relationship, to treat me like a human being is enough. Mm-hmm. And it didn't take away the fact that she was homeless. It didn't take away a history of deep drug use. It wasn't intended to. There is something revitalizing in itself to be seen and met from one human being to another, and to not look at someone in their pathology. And that humanistic approach is not easy. When I talk about taking off the grains of sand from the lens, that was years of practice. Yeah. And humbly recognizing where I, in my own, ego, was going, these are the ways I cut myself off from other people. And to through years of practice with some of these teachers that are even in the immersion, clearing those, painfully so, and sometimes joyfully so, clearing those to be able to sit with another human being in their humanness, in just fundamental connection and relationship. And what's beautiful is that the science, especially the neuroscience, is coming out to support, oh my gosh, just being with someone in relationship, sewing back those ruptures of relationship are significant, and they are healing, and they matter. Helping someone. Yeah, sorry.
Really beautiful. No, it's just really beautiful. Really enjoying you hear your heart and your passion about that. I mean, it seems really the core of it to me.
Thank you. Yeah.
I realized I was kind of asking you two questions. One was about hierarchy of needs, and the other one was about the sort of the luxury of kind of having all these different teachers available to us. Like, is there a way in which people could come to this event you're doing? Or, I fear people come to my podcast almost like consumers of like, okay, there's 180 episodes. I'll have a little bit of Scott today, followed by a little bit of India from Israel. And you know what I mean? It's like a supermarket, And the same with, you've got these 10 great speakers, or the conference is going to have 1,000 people, different teachers there. And it's like, there's a risk in that people become consumers. Do you know what I mean? That there's so much stuff that we can get on the internet, whereas maybe in the past you only had one yoga teacher in your town. Even at my university, which is a pretty big university, there was like 5 martial arts clubs, and I picked one. I went to the others a couple of times, maybe in the first week of university, but then I picked one and I stayed with it for 3 years. Mm-hmm. Is there a risk of some sort of superficiality or kind of consumerism in this just huge wealth of teachers we're presented with?
Possibly. It's a good question. I don't know if I can say for certain, because I would put myself in that category, having consumed a lot of different modalities. And there is a risk of having a tasting menu as opposed to the full course meal. And an appetizer as opposed to the full course meal. Yeah. And that has its potential, and I don't know. I love having a diversity of teachers to choose from. I think, but that also comes from having spent many years with a primary teacher, or maybe 2 or 3 primary teachers, depending on the focus. But I like hearing that diversity of perspective. It can also get confusing, to be honest. When you hear one thing from perhaps one yoga teacher, and then you hear something completely different from another, and you hear something completely different, even as something as like, what do you do with your arms in the sockets?
Right. Even a practical thing. Yeah.
Even a very biomechanical type of, or breathing. It's like, I don't know. And this is where I really appreciate and love Tara so much, is she could say all of that in her classes. She could say, here's what you should do, just as anyone else could say, give it the instruction. But there's something about going, well, here, from like an experiential anatomy perspective, well, here's your arm, here's your shoulder. Let's feel the tangibleness of the bone, where they connect. And then based on that self-information, what wants to emerge? What's the expression that wants to emerge? How does it where does it feel the most sense of freedom in you? So one of the things that can happen in certain practices, and then as you're talking from a diversity of practices, is that we lose our own sense of power. And going back to what Reverend Angel and Ray Johnson are very invested in, is where is the power? And there is an opportunity in sometimes in modern yoga and somatic practices, and many in psychotherapy, in which the power is there's a hierarchy of power, in which the power is taken from the person who is the client or the practitioner, the student, excuse me, and it is nearly impossible to inhabit oneself without the power and the resources to do it. And so when power is sort of taken from us and we become reliant on other people, we essentially are becoming more disconnected to ourselves and our capacity, because power leads to agency. So agency is our capacity to recognize, first of all, ourselves, to recognize that we have ourselves and that we have choices, to see the choices we have, and then to actualize those choices. And so when we take away power from an individual, and there are multiple ways we do so as facilitators and teachers and practitioners, and not intending to do so, that we can potentially take someone away from their agency. And there's a direct correlation between embodiment, the coming into ourself in order to find ourselves, to recognize our agency, to really find ourselves surfing and engaging and dancing in this world, that we're not just leaves blowing in the wind. And in doing so, when we have a sense of ourself from this embodied perspective and agency, it leads us down more of a dharmic path. We know where we want to go, and we're part of that process. So it gives us a sense of meaning making, which is, from research on social science research, we know that meaning making and a sense of belonging is one of the pillars of well-being. So ananda, well-being. And so we can start to see along any of this course, where power or a sense of ourself can support that process of coming into a sense of belonging and meaning making in this world.
Gorgeous. Can you say a little bit more about the ways people may take power from students? I mean, are you talking about, the classic yoga teachers adjusting people's bodies without asking, or the kind of everyone having to do it in a certain set way, that it's sort of reducing that agency? I mean, I think there's a lot of teachers who listen to this, and as you say, some of these are sort of very well intended and
absolutely, yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, it's okay. You can interrupt me. I'm from an Irish family. We all interrupt each other. It's fine. And I was just explaining to an Israeli colleague yesterday that when she comes to England to work with us, that it will be considered rude if she interrupts me in meetings. And it was quite a funny conversation. We had a lot of laughs about it. It's a big cultural difference. Anyway, so the conversation there was just talking. I was asking you more to say a little bit more about power and disempowerment, because I feel like that's a really important topic.
It is an important topic. I really want to say to those who are listening, if you find yourself doing any of the following sort of approaches, I don't want to shame anyone. When coming from talking about social activism to anything, I feel it's so important not to shame. Because once you start to use shame language, you shut someone down from being truly part of the dynamic relationship where change is possible. So, there are a multitude of ways in which power is taken on as the facilitator, which is, even in the name teacher. From a somatic perspective, when you say teacher, what is the posturing or the feeling that comes with that? Sometimes, for me, and I don't want to project onto anyone else, there's a certain level of contraction and pressure where I all of a sudden have to be the expert. And to shift from the expert to the role of expert, or the title of expert, to the title of, hey, we're co-journeying through life. And I'm here as a support system, as a container, as a mirror to support you becoming the expert of your own life. So just simply, the idea that we have to be the expert. And, and then I heard you say there's a lot of yoga teachers that listen to this. And my gosh, my heart breaks often when I am talking to yoga teachers, and I don't know what's happened in the last, I do have a sense of what's happened in the last 10 years, but from, my training some years ago to now, there's so much more pressure to be an expert, of like, you have to be a trauma expert, and you have to be a nutrition expert, and you have to be an expert in essential oils, and an expert in nutrition, and a hairdresser, and then an expert in music and DJing, and an expert in philosophy and biomechanics. I mean, to be fair, that's so much pressure. I've spent, 32 years in school as well, to come out and be like, I have a lot of information and I'm no one's expert.
And there's a movement towards sort of facilitator rather than teacher.
Yeah. It takes away the hierarchy. And, one of the things, to go back to the particular faculty that we were talking about, each one of them, does not, has found ways to remove that sort of vertical positioning towards students. Because of their own practice embodying this fundamental relationship, they recognize from the sort of core of their being that doesn't exist, that hierarchy. It is a delusion that we put onto ourselves or others put onto us. And it's fair that often students or patients or clients will put that onto us, of being the expert of their life. And it is not an easy process of returning the power back to them.
Yeah, we had a psychotherapist from Israel, Near Easterman, talk about sort of projection and identification, all these sort of psychoanalytic processes that happen with teachers. So I'd really recommend that to any listeners who are out there, interested in that topic. And is there something though about still recognizing competence though, right? Like still recognizing there's a hierarchy of competence, and Bonnie's an elder in this work, and there's a certain deference I have to different teachers in this work, even if I don't agree with everything they say, or I still have agency when I'm in their class. But there's definitely a certain respect I have for people who've been around this stuff for a lot longer than I have. Yeah,
there is a competence, but it's not an intellectual competence. It's a inhabited, lived experience that is the competency. sitting with Sally Kenton and Bonnie Bainbridge Cohn. And by the way, they've never been in a room together. So this in itself is like one of the most exciting things for me. But, the way that they have, this is together, 100 years of experience just between the two of them?
Uh-huh.
That's a shit ton
Yep.
of competence and knowledge and wisdom and experience. And both of them are some of the most humble people I know, and are so astute at supporting people's empowerment back to themselves. And so I really have learned from my teachers that competency, well, you might have a lot of tools of how to make a map a living process for someone, like the guidance process. It is recognizing that is the competency, from being able to be so in touch with oneself, to be in touch with someone else, to really make it a live, active map. So like when we look at I'll use a European reference. So to get from Berlin to Munich, for example, or London to Paris, there is a particular map. It's linear. It's set in stone of like, this is the path of the train, and this is how it gets to. That doesn't represent the sort of emergent process of a human being, the emergent process of healing and transformation of a human being. And by emergent, I mean unpredictable, nonlinear, constantly inventing and recreating itself. And there's and so we are emergent beings. We are in constant process. And there is no sort of thing as, when we get to this concept of like, this is who I am, and it's set in stone, I would say you've fallen out of the emergent process of what it is to be a human being.
Yeah, there's always going to be suffering as soon as people solidify, isn't there? Around
for sure, the moment you grasp, that is the root of suffering, and from so many traditions, because you are taking what's fluid and moving and creating stagnancy to it. And so to come back to the competency of people like Bonnie and Sally and everyone that I take on as my teachers, it's because the competency is the fact that they've accrued all this wisdom and are able to make to create a map that is both clear but also a living, kind of flowing in process map. And they're able to meet who's there. And that's, to me, is the competency of so many years of accruing so much information and deep fundamental connection.
Nice. God, I feel like we're moving towards a close here. This is it's great. I'll talk to you all day. We should just put some practical details. So if people want to find you, they go to drscottlyons.com, right?
Yeah, it's drscottlyons.com.
That's COTTLYONS, scottlyons.com. Yeah. And in terms of, we'll make sure we get this out pretty quick, so people are, it's before the event we've been talking about. So where do people find that?
Sure, that's on the website embodiedflow.com, EMBODIED, flow, FLOW.com. And there's a lot of videos, so you can see videos of all the faculty on there that I've interviewed, and which is, that in itself is a beautiful resource. And then there's a lot more information on the site, what you'll get out of it, who will be there.
You have some great art and photography and video on the Embodied Flow site. You've really done well with the aesthetics there. Sort of Tara in beautiful dresses in the sea and on mountains and all sorts of things. It's really, really, really. Yeah. That's like you jumping into mountains. Beautiful. Nice. Yeah. Okay. Well, I also found the event on your site as well. Yes. So that's what I was quickly Googling. So I found it in a couple of places. So,
I think the videos are on the Embodied Flow site.
Got it. So that's the better place to go. Okay. I'm sad I won't be able to make it myself because it looks super juicy, but maybe next year or the year after if it happens again. And, credit to you for putting something together which is actually integrating the different teachers rather than just, having them as big names or whatever. It's like you're actually integrating them there. So, that's super lovely to see. So just to close, Scott, any final message about the body for our listeners?
Oh, It's an epic journey, and I think to just know that there are so many incredible people on the same process and journey, and I just support and I appreciate what you're doing, Mark, so much, because I feel like you're creating another container or a community for people who are on this process of re-inhabiting, of coming home, of enhancing what it means to be alive, and really supporting, creating a safe space for them to connect. It's, it's so fundamentally important in this time period right now we're in.
Scott, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you, Mark.
Some ways to get more, to give back, and to get more involved now. So the biggest request I have would be to share the podcast with your friends, people that you think would really enjoy it. Email it to them, put it on your social media, tell them about it, old school. Really appreciate that. Equally, if you want to support us financially, you can go to Patreon. That's patreon.com/embodiment podcast and give us $1 an episode. And I'd say they're well worth $1. So that's less than £1 if you're in UK-ish. So yeah, please go there. On the embodiedfacilitator.com website is where this is hosted. Most people I think listen to for iTunes. iTunes, we'd certainly appreciate a review. The way iTunes works means that a review means more people will find it. iTunes regards it as more important for searches. So even a couple of sentences review really does help as a little thank you to us. And if you want to go to embodiedfacilitator.com, you can see the actual, links to the sites. There's comments on there. The Facebook group tends to be where people discuss things. So if you go to put in the Embodiment podcast into Facebook, there's a page which is relatively quiet and a group which does have some discussion on. So I will reply to things personally there. So also on embodiedfacilitator.com website, there's all sorts of freebies there. There's videos, there's free ebooks, there's ebooks you can buy. And of course, there's our newsletter list. If you want to stay in touch and learn about things like the Embodied Facilitator course and our next Embodied Yoga Principles teacher training, then go to that website and you'll see a little pop-up and you can get the newsletter through there. Okay, so I think they're the main ones. Tell your friends, pay us some money on Patreon, give us a review on iTunes, send us your email if you want to be on the newsletter list, and get involved on the Facebook there. Bit long. Pick whatever you like that works for you. Until next time, welcome home to the body.